Welcome, everybody, to our workshop. I see some young people here, so maybe I have to explain. IBM is a 112-year-old technology company. We've been around for a good while, but we tend to do business with other businesses, so you might not have heard of us if you're very young. We're going to talk about generative AI, how we do that in a responsible way, because we are really a very responsible company. My name's HP. I head up our AI governance, What's Not X governance initiative for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. 3 very different regions, also when we talk about AI implementations. I've got 2 really clever people with me. I've got Annelies Delbecq. She heads up the North Central Eastern Europe data and AI team. And I've got the cleverest of them all, Martijn. He heads up our technical AI governance team for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So they'll come on stage after me. I'll just give you a quick introduction to what this is all about. In June, our good friends in McKinsey released a report called The Economical Potential of Generative AI. It's significant. They estimate that it's going to generate between 2.6 and 4.4 trillion dollars of additional AI value. Right? So it will add about somewhere between 15 and 40% to the overall value creation of AI. And also significantly, it's going to cut about a decade of the time we as humans will use to adopt AI, right? So safe to say, generative AI has democratized how we as users use AI. They've pointed at 4 areas where they think 75% of the value will be created. It's customer support, customer operations, I think to call it. That's sort of an obvious one. It's research and development. Some pharmas are now using generative AI to cut down the time it takes to discover new drugs and applications of drugs. Software engineering, if you as a software engineer can create 80% of your new code using generative AI, why not? You know, there might be some property issues and ownership issues, but we'll get to that. And sales and marketing as well. So just saying that generative AI is something we're all talking about. I think the initial hype created by OpenAI and ChatGPT is sort of dying down a little bit, and the usage of ChatGPT is dropping. That's okay. We're now starting to work on business use cases for generative AI and how we blend it with well-proven AI. I absolutely hate the term traditional. Traditional to me is like when somebody asks me for my age, I don't say I'm middle-aged, I say I'm experienced. So it's experienced AI, let's use that term, right? And how you blend it. We've done IBM Institute of Research, IBM's Institute for Business Value have done a recent study amongst the world's CEOs about generative AI as well. A couple of key findings inside 2 years. 85% of the world's CEOs think that generative AI will speak directly to their clients. That's a pretty strong statement. And how do we do that responsibly then? And also, AI and data governance belongs in the boardrooms. This is no longer an arena for data scientists and technologists alone. It belongs in the boardrooms. I'm not sure if I'm going to make this work, but I'm going to try, right? Has anybody tried to remove a gallbladder with a corkscrew? No? Could be a brilliant idea, you know? Why not? I look at experienced AI the same way I look at a precision tool, right? It's created for one purpose. It does that one thing incredibly well. I reckon that's probably why surgeons have precision tools. They don't use a Swiss Army knife to remove gallbladders. You know, in a emergency situation, you might think it is a good idea, and it maybe actually works as well. You know, it works well, and maybe it democratizes the use of a corkscrew. But if you want to implement gallbladder removal responsibly, you want to control the tools the people that use when they remove them, right? Much the same way that we don't implement generative AI use cases through very generic applications that you can use for anything. If you want, and this is the first starting point, if you want to implement generative AI responsibly, you reduce the number of tools available on the Swiss Army knife. Maybe you give your user 2 to 3 tools for a specific task. Did that work? It's the first time I used that story. Did it work? Huh? Okay, ish. Right. So our other friends in Gartner 2 years ago, they defined AI governance as a new concept. Okay. It's quite useful. It's controlling processes, it's controlling usage, it's decision rights, it's workflows, collaboration, and we've obviously built a mechanical way to do all of this. We'll get to that a little bit later. There are a number of risk elements when you implement AI, right? You have accountability, you have accuracy risks, you have fairness. Fairness is interesting. What is fairness? Very different things. Veracity, transparency, drift. The concept of drift is you train your model on one training set, you put it in production, inevitably production data is different from training data, and the model starts to behave differently, right? Just as this fine employee you hired 3 years ago one day wakes up and is a horrible racist, you have processes and procedures to monitor behaviors so they don't damage your reputation. Very much the same with AI. It will change behavior and you need to monitor it. Trusted data is an interesting concept in this day and age. We'll talk a little bit about data later too. Energy consumption. Do you know how much it costs to train GPT-3? Well, one thing is expensive, yeah, and computer power, yeah, but how much energy? 1.297 gigawatts, right? And was anybody around in the 80s? In the 80s, right? So you'll understand this reference. That's enough power to send a DeLorean back to the future. Okay, that's a lot of power. That's not sustainable if everybody trains models that big, right? Explainability. C-level people really worry about how to explain the outcomes of AI. Of course, they should worry because you need to be able to explain it to your clients. And if 85% think that we're going to talk directly to clients using generative AI models in 2 years, we have a lot of explaining to do. Robustness and IP leakage are two very significant risk areas as well. Now, our good friends in EU, as the first, I would say, probably serious lawmaker, is attempting to regulate AI. This EU AI Act will pass in this EU parliamentary period, and there's an EU parliamentary election in June next year. So it's going to pass inside a couple of months. Right now, it's between the Council and the Parliament to negotiate the final sort of words in the Act before they actually pass. And then we'll have a 24-month transition period. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The EU have taken a risk-based approach, so they're saying we'll leave the technology. Originally, they wanted to regulate the technology. We're very happy that they don't, because that would kill innovation, right? But they regulate how we as companies apply technology towards our users. And they've defined 4 categories of risk. I actually have one category that's prohibited, right? And that's things like social scoring. When I read the first criticism of the EU AI Act, they don't really make specific examples. And you can argue that an app like Tinder has an element of social scoring. I don't think they're going to prohibit Tinder in the EU. That would be a shame. And they also use some really strange examples, like using AI to play inaudible sounds in the driving cabins of truck drivers to make them drive longer. I don't think any of IBM clients do that. But a lot of our clients will have high-risk use cases. High-risk use cases are things like education, transport, but also HR. Right? So if you have an AI application screening CVs and recommending candidates, that's a high-risk use case. And with the high-risk use case comes a very specific set of requirements that we'll also talk about. Limited risk is just they use chatbots and deepfakes. Actually, interesting. I don't think the Russians are going to tell us that we're now looking at a deepfake. But anyway, where you just have to declare upfront that you're now talking to a chatbot. You're now watching a deepfake. Okay. And minimal risk, there will be millions and millions of AI use cases, minimal risks where there are no particular limitations or requirements. The draft regulation was issued in spring 2021. Life was in many ways really not very complicated in 2021. Life really became complicated in November last year when OpenAI democratized AI with ChatGPT and GPT technology. So foundation models, generative AI, is one of the things that the EU are still discussing, okay? From a concept of regulation, we separate the model, so GPT-3, GPT-4 is the model, and the application. ChatGPT is the application that prompts the model and makes the model do stuff. So actually you apply the application to the user, right? So we're advocating that they leave the model unregulated and regulate the application, so ChatGPT and the prompts, right? And when we talk about trusted implementation of generative AI, we're going to talk about foundation models. There's a very, very vibrant open source community. Yes, sir. Is it okay to ask questions? Of course, yeah.
So my thought on this, when you also say the model needs to be somewhat regulated, right?
No, we would rather not.
Yeah, because I'm thinking right now in terms of OpenAI.
That's, yeah. We haven't gotten to the question yet. I was interrupting him. Sorry.
Yeah, but I'm stuck.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, just say the question.
So basically, it's when we come into a. Okay, so now we're trying it like this.
Yes.
When we get into a realm of, for example, when we talk about GPT-4.
Yep.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but OpenAI was a little hesitant or did not disclose certain info that you would expect when you develop an AI to publish, like what kind of data was it trained on, what was the energy consumption, etc. Right? So that's highly privatized right now. In that instance, there's no real way to regulate the model in and of itself. So it probably comes down to a transparency issue, right?
Yep, that's right. That's how I would look at it. And if you want a really, really bad joke, you could say that OpenAI has become closed AI, right? Because they don't publish any other research, none of the algorithms going into the models. That's a transparency issue more than a regulation issue, right? The model itself is just a model trained on a lot of data. It doesn't do anything until you prompt it, you know? And that's why you need to regulate the prompting mechanism, and the prompting mechanism is the application you put on top of the foundation model. We will see much smaller foundation models that are really, really specific for tasks or a subset of tasks for what generative AI can do, right? And because nobody can seriously expect us to train models that big. And Llama 2, for instance, is a much smaller open source model from Meta. It's better on language in many cases, and it's trained on a fraction of the energy consumption.
Or to your question is, we'll come back to this later, but you then have a choice, right? As an organization, when you get a model proposed like that and you don't know what went in, you don't know what how, you have a choice to accept it, yes or no. It's not a given that you have to.
Exactly.
Right? So that's part of the governance is what are your own internal rules for letting these models in? What's the minimum that you need to know in order to be comfortable to use it? Yeah. More about that later.
It does require understanding. You're absolutely right.
First of all, thanks for the mic first. But basically, on a level of data scientists, often there is very in-depth knowledge on, you know, how transformers work, how models work. But when it goes to the C-level, it basically is, hey, GPT-4 is cool, we need that, right?
So that's changing with regulation, because any chief compliance officer and chief risk officer is going to worry about being compliant from a regulatory perspective, right?
Yeah, hopefully.
Yes, well, they will. Oh, yes, because there are fines associated with this, and they're quite significant. Anyway, I see that I'm already spending a lot of time on this. So from an IBM perspective, we've defined 3 pillars of AI governance. Lifecycle governance, how do you control your model/application from birth to retirement? Somebody has a good idea, it triggers a workflow for the approval of the idea, and somebody starts developing the application of the model, train it, put it into production. Inevitably, it's going to start drifting, so you need to monitor it. And then you need to fix the problem and maybe reiterate versions of it, and then eventually retirement. That's lifecycle management. And the regulators will expect that, by the way. They will expect full lifecycle management documentation from high-risk use cases. Risk management, spoke about that. Inevitably, it's going to start behaving differently. And with generative AI, it's going to hallucinate too. You know, how do you actually spot hallucination? And regulatory compliance, this at the moment is a little bit of wild, wild west because we're still developing the technical standards, right? So this is where we are in the process. It will pass in December or January, you know. And what EU have said is in the law itself, and the law actually regulates market access. So without being compliant with the law, you don't have access to the EU single market. End of. For your AI, right? For your AI. In the law, they'll stipulate essential requirements. So in order to be compliant, these are the essential requirements. They can use text like, use high-quality training data. What's that, right? That's where the essential requirements turn into standardization requests. And then the two European standardization bodies, CEN and CENELEC, will define and write the standards, right? So you will obtain some sort of conformity assessment that you comply with the regulation based on your implementation of the standard, technical standards, and then you'll have presumption of conformity and you have market access. That's how it is. It's going to take at least 24 months, okay? Because there are loads of essential requirements that will turn into loads of standardizations and standards. This is according to the EU new legislative framework for technical standards and technical regulation. Now, I said they're discussing whether or not to include foundation models / generative AI. The EU Parliament are advocating regulating the foundation model, i.e. the tech. The EU Council is not. The EU Council wants to regulate the usage of the generative AI application and the prompting. So we'll see, I think, who's more powerful, the Parliament or the Council. And, you know, you could also make a joke here that the Parliament are politicians, and politicians are really good at being politicians and not necessarily know a lot about AI. So we'll see. I spoke about essential requirements. For high-risk use cases, we have 7 essential requirements that so far have been made into 10 draft standardization requests that CENELEC are currently working on. Okay, I'll discuss this a little bit more for those that are really, really nerdy and interested in this. But right now, Annelies, she's actually going to give us a real-life example.
Sure. Thank you, HB.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, hello everyone. I want to share with you a use case that we did with a large bank in Europe. So, the challenges that they were seeing was that there are upcoming EU AI regulations, and also that there was a rising use of AI in the bank. So, what was it that they were really looking for? It was a centralized governance platform. It was not saying everything that we do with AI, we all need to have it on the same platform. No, it was saying we need to have an overview of all our models throughout the bank, whether it are models that are more static or whether it are really those AI governance models. And behind that, they also wanted to have workflow management. And I will explain more. Now, for the banking sector, they are doing model risk management for years. Definitely since 2008, they know regulatory capital models, right? It's really knowing how much equity can you have on your balance sheet. This is one of the models that they're already managing for years. The second type of models they have are compliancy models. Know your customer. They can be also pretty static, and now they also start to use AI models. Now, the third type of models they start to see now are business models. It can be next best action, customer churn, and definitely with generative AI, all type of AI models that you're using in serving your business, so in contact with the customer. And the fourth type of model are service models. Those are the models that you use internally for HR, for legal, and so on. Now, when we look from a governance perspective, we see that for regulatory risk models, and they talk about 3 lines of defense in risk, you can see that it is very well organized. For the second pillar, the compliancy models, it's already a little bit less well organized. For the business models and service models, a little bit less. But the key of this slide is how siloed it is. And you see that a lot in banking is that they know very well how to do the first 2 pillars, but they have not been thinking holistically, how are we going to work with our models? We don't have a one approach to work with models. So that's the first thing we start doing there. How do we want to really monitor, or what is the life cycle that also HP has been talking about? How does it look, such a life cycle? Are we going to prototype? When we are having test data, does it need to go in front of a committee? And it doesn't, like not for all AI models, you need to have the same approach. You can have exceptions, but at least everyone knows how to work with a model. There is one unified approach to it. Then what we did after that was really to plot all the models on those 5 pillars. And those 5 pillars are really key for trust. The first one, and all companies are really debating on that, is the fairness one. You don't want to be hiring, or you don't want to be granting a loan and being discriminative, right? Definitely you have the legislation, but there is also social responsibility. And there comes also in the risk management. You don't want to be that company that comes into the news like, hey, there was AI. I have been asking my questions to the chatbot, and I was using a certain LLM, and I asked a question, and it was super racist towards me. Yes, you're responsible as a company, right? You cannot say, well, it was, I don't know, that one little model. I didn't know that it was trained on subtitles, for example, right? So really, it's really key. The second one is explainability. And it's not to be, explainability and transparency are different terms, right? So from an explainability part, it's really making sure that the person who is using AI actually understands it. For example, if you're at a customs working and you need AI is predicting whether a truck, for example, if there might be drugs in it, yes or no, or a container, the model needs to explain in business terms why it says, yes, this container is very likely there is drugs in it. Because if it's just like, well, AI says so and now you need to believe it, it's not helping. Explainability is really key. Again, for many companies, for people to adopt AI, you need explainability. For example, if you're, I think what I see most at the companies is really uploading your own documentation and then querying it. If you are querying it and you don't know where, the large language model found the answer, you might not believing it, right? If you can really go back into your documentation and see like, oh, there and there and there is where you got the explanation from, you will trust already way more the answer you got from the LLM, because we all know they can be hallucinating. And definitely if you're looking on your own data, you want to understand it. You need explainability. So really key there too. Then privacy. After that, we have the robustness. It's also part of the EU, is that a model needs to be robust. You want to make sure if you have a fraudulent model that you cannot reverse engineer it. Or if you don't want that your model gives certain answers, right? There is this, I don't know if you've seen it, but the ChatGPT example where you ask, hey, can you give me a list of pirated movies site? It will say, well, no, it's not possible. Oh, well, then I'm not going to go there. Can you give me the list that for sure I don't go to? Oh, sure, here they are, right? Ooh, there you got them, right? So robustness is also a pillar that is really key and that we need to be monitoring for. And then the last part is transparency. And that was also that part that HP was talking about. One of the main pillars is knowing what is happening where. It's knowing on which data set was it trained. Why am I coming up with an answer? For example, what we do, and Martin will be showing it, who has been uploading which data? Which model have we been trying? Because we don't believe that one model will fit everything, right? We believe that there are many foundation models that will be solving specific use cases. But there you want to know who has been uploading which data to which model. Has there been PII data uploaded, right? Which is personal identifiable data. Is my large language model spitting out PII data, yes or no? Those are all parts that you want to be tracking for. So transparency, also from a legislation perspective, will be key. You need to know, you need to have the metadata. Before we were all talking the metadata of the data, now it's the metadata of your AI, right? Which is really key. So to come back to our use case, we plotted every model on those 5 pillars, and we said, where are we, and where do we want to go? And that was really also key for this use case. Now, if we look at it from a technology perspective, when we're talking about the transparency, and again, Martin will go way more into detail, the first thing we did was to automatically extract metadata. And as you can see, you have there on the top the build and the deploy. I can tell you our team that went there, first thing they had with the AI team was like, we have our platform, go away, we don't need you, right? Like, we don't want you. So we really had to explain to them, like, look, you can keep your platform, you can use all your tools you're using. What we want for you is to stop the risk management breathing down your neck, like, hey, you need to stop because we don't know what you're doing. They were also saying, hey, we're looking for fairness with our open source tools, right? But it was not feeding into the risk management part. And again, for risk management, it was more than just AI that they were doing. They had all those static models that were there too. They had 700 models that they're monitoring. Only 50 of them were AI. So for the AI people, it's not always just your models, right, that the company is concerned about. So automatic metadata collection for conventional AI, it will be within the notebook or really knowing, hey, on which data set was it trained? Where is the model in production? Is it still accurate? For large language models, it will be who has been uploading which data, was there PI data out part of it, and so on. The second step that we did was then to automatically monitor for bias, fairness, and also for the robustness. All the data would then feed into that centralized governance platform that the bank was really looking for from a risk management perspective, and to have the workflows behind it. Because very nice, someone has been uploading PII data, and now PII data is coming out of the model. Then what happens, right? You need to have business controls in place. And it's not because in the US you are allowed to use a certain model that you're allowed to use it in Europe. Again, you want to have those business controls to make sure that whatever you're doing with AI, and this is really at C-level, everyone is concerned. They want to have a little bit a view of what's going on, and having such a centralized governance platform really gave them that view. So with that, Martin will go way more into detail. Thank you.
Thank you.
There you go.
Right. So talk a little bit about governance of foundation models. The French bank that Annelies talked about started kind of before that trend. So they started with their conventional models. They're now moving also looking at foundation models and how do we govern that. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. One part of that is that there are, as it says here, traditional, amplified and new risks. So some of the risks that HP had on his slide, with the matrix of the 4x3 or whatever it was, some of those still apply to large language models. Some of them are more problematic now with large language models, and some of them are new ones. So our own IBM's AI Ethics Board, our internal organization, published this white paper, which is also available externally, where they outline in this table here 3 pages of risks that they've identified, that we as IBM through our research identified and labeled them, whether they are new or amplified or existing ones. So that's a good resource. The download page is here. I don't know how easy it is to see from the back, but you can stop by the booth if you want to details, and you can't see it here. But that's a handy document that describes those risks and kind of the way we look at them and what we apply internally as well when we govern our own efforts of using AI within the company. The consequences of those things for governance, I kind of distinguish governance kind of at the macro level, things you do as an organization, and then at the micro level, things you do in an individual project or an individual use case or an individual problem you're solving. So at the macro level, these are the kind of things that we see being new in governance of large language models. Typically, as we talked about just now with the question from the gentleman there, the approval of a foundation model is kind of taken out of the cycle of an individual project, because these models are multi-purpose. They solve many problems, can be applied in many different use cases. So you kind of need to elevate that up to the macro level and approve those models before you use them, right? That's what we see with governance happening, is people take a look at those models, asking the questions that we talked about, right? What is the data that was trained on, and so on and so forth, to approve these models to use then down the line for the use cases where they are applicable. Things like updating your risk frameworks, updating your internal education to make sure that people are aware of these new risks, that they're taken into account. If you have things like what we internally call ethics by design, so as part of your operational workflow, you have kind of ethics considerations and ethics steps and ethic activities, make sure that they are updated, that they account for those new risks. And then vendor management. I think that's a big thing where we've only seen the beginning, but because most of these models will come from outside of your organization, I think that will change in how every organization deals with their vendors, the kind of questions they ask, the things that will go into RFP questions around how transparent is the model, right? Is it safe? Is it unbiased? Is it all these kind of things? That's something I expect to see change more in let's say, the next 12 months or so. So those are considerations kind of at the macro level to consider. At the micro level, then, at the level of the individual project or the individual use case, this is kind of the classical model that we've been doing so far and that the French bank has implemented, where you start on a business problem, you approve that use case, right? You do an initial risk assessment of the use case. Somebody needs to own that risk case, that use case, and based on that, you decide what kind of heavy touch or light touch do we need to apply to this. But from there on, the actual cycle starts. We train the model, we review and approve it, we deploy it, we keep an eye on it as it's running in production. Any issues that come up, we manage those, and we've got a workflow for that. And then if something needs to change, there's a change request which feeds into maybe retraining the model. This cycle keeps looping for the duration of the life cycle of your model. At some point, you might say, we don't need this anymore, right? Business has changed, we've got a better approach, whatever it might be. But to take the model out of action, to retire the model. So that's kind of the governance picture, the way it's been so far. With large language models, most of that stays the same, but there's a few extra kind of gotchas to it, or kind of extra changes to it. As mentioned, the approval of the model kind of sits outside of the cycle now. So that's done at the beginning, along with the use case. When we approve the model, is looking at these things. Where does the data come from? What are the terms and conditions, right? Is the vendor going to use our data to retrain their model, yes or no? And would you like that to happen, yes or no? Energy consumption, the cost of using these things, what tasks is it good for, and what tasks will you allow it to do? Right? You don't have to, because GPT does everything, it doesn't mean you have to allow it for everything. So there's a distinction you can make between what are the tasks that the model supports and which ones will we allow it. For example, if you have 2 or 3 models that do a summarization task, but one is clearly more energy efficient or more cheaper to use, right? You might want to guide people towards that one and use that one instead of the more expensive or the more energy consumption model. So those are kind of choices and trade-offs you can start to make. We still govern the use case mostly the way we've already done them, with the addition of explicitly listing what are the generative tasks involved. Is this a summarization problem? Is this a classification problem, a translation, or whatever it is? Right? And then, like I said, we'll be able to match these two things. We say we've got a number of models that we've approved. They do certain things. We know what is required from the use case. We match these two, and we can make these trade-offs. If there are multiple models that satisfy what we need it to be, make the trade-off between accuracy, between cost, and all these other things that you might want to consider in your organization. So defining these workflows behind it, that's where some of the changes are. At the top right, a step of model fine-tuning, kind of optional in a sense, right? You don't have to do that, but that's one of the things that's available to you. When you do that, what that means is that you build a new model. So the one that you've approved there at the top left, you build a derived model. That is an object in itself that needs to be governed in its own right. So you've got the original model, you've got the derived model, and then maybe the prompts against that, right? You've got more things potentially to govern than just a model in the old cycle. Talked about that already. The review and the monitoring, they kind of sit side by side. There are additional metrics to consider. Large language models, they do things differently, right? It has to be kind of task specific. There's different metrics for summarization or translation or an entity extraction task. So those are additional metrics, newer ones. Some of them exist, some of them are still sort of actively being developed. But those are kind of new metrics that are coming into the industry now and that people are starting to adopt for those use cases. And then if there's a change, that change could be one of many things. It could be you change your foundation model that you use, right? We just introduced our own Granite model, so people who use our platform now have a choice to use something else for their problem. Maybe they do that, right? Whatever they used before, they change it to a new model. Maybe you didn't do fine-tuning in the first go-round, but you do want to do it at some point, see if you can make it better. Or you might change the prompts that you use against that, right? So again, not just the governance of it, but also the change request could be of multiple objects, not just a single model, but there could be multiple things to govern there. So those are some of the kind of the things where this workflow, this end-to-end workflow, is a little different than what it was. Things to take into account. This is the picture that Annelies already showed, so let me just build it out and then talk about it, just highlight a few more things. It's these three building blocks in blue that are the main kind of capabilities of governance, right? So you need to have your governance activities, things like risk assessments, things like approval workflows, things like incident management, right? If you monitor your model and suddenly one of them is dropping in accuracy, what did you agree in your organization is the response to that? How are you going to deal with that? Who needs to know about it? If you want to retrain things, who needs to approve that? But again, depending on the use case, it might be low touch, it might be heavy touch. If it's one of those high-risk use cases in the AI Act, you want to have probably more oversight into that than if it's a low-risk use case and you can just let the data scientists deal with it, kind of maybe even in an automated manner. But knowing about these things and then applying at a use case level the right amount of governance kind of happens there. Model documentation throughout the life cycle, we gather information from the model as it's being developed, as it's being tested and then deployed and then monitored to be able to support those governance activities. And at the bottom, monitoring these things. So measuring things like accuracy and drift and bias and providing explainability, those kind of things for both classical models as well as foundation models. Kind of the three big areas that work together to do that with whatever technical platform kind of is there. So in our mind, we kind of separate the governance from the ML ops or FM ops or whatever you want to call it, right, from the operational space. The operational platform, the operational process will run many, many times in different technologies. Things you build yourself as an organization, things you get from your vendors. Right? Adobe has just launched their generative AI capabilities in their production versions. Bloomberg is building their own. If you're in finance, Salesforce, everybody is on this train. So your organization will likely have generative AI in probably 10, 15, 20 different places. Right? So some kind of governance layer across that where you know where all these things are, you know which ones are high risk, which ones you need a closer look at, and which ones you need a less closer look at because they're lower risk, is a good thing to have. And then mapping that onto the articles from the EU AI Act. This is not to say, these are the kind of the capabilities we have in our software as well. Not to say that these are the things where we'll have a button or a menu item, right, specifically for each article, but kind of conceptually mapping where in this flow do these things happen. Some of them are kind of clearly one-to-one linked. If you have something like post-market monitoring, in the words of the EU Act, that's literally them saying you need to monitor your models after you put them in production, right? So that's kind of a very straight one-to-one link. In terms of transparency and technical documentation there at the top, that's kind of where the model documentation side of the story comes in. Some of the things probably better taken care of in the operational process, things like data logging and keeping records and those kind of things. That happens in the operational process anyway, so kind of maybe best place to do them there. But again, this is kind of our mapping of where some of these things take place. And one thing to note is that box in the middle is rather big. A lot of that happens in the top right side of the space, right? A lot of these things are not necessarily data science activities, things done by a data scientist, but they're done by a compliance team, a legal team, an audit team, right? Those kind of other players that get involved in the process now with these kind of things coming on. What that looks like, just to give you a bit of visual what that looks like in in the tooling. So this could be the workflow to approve a foundation model. It's a little wide out from the projector, but I hope you can see this. Right, it starts. We need to do a check on the data, the training data. There's a legal check, an ethics check, finance check. This is an example of the way we provide it out of the box. You're free to take this and expand this, right? Add things, take it out, build one completely from scratch. But this is kind of the workflow that you might agree in your organization that we want to have, or you want to have, when you have a new foundation model that's available to use. What are the things you want to assess from that thing before you say, yep, we're happy with this and we trust this model? And then the details behind it, right? We capture, as mentioned, we capture information about these models from when they're created to when they're used and deployed. So this is a quick look at for the Bloom model, just some monitoring information. Yes, it's approved for deployment, so that's one has gone through that cycle and has made it out the other end as something we're happy for people to use. Somewhere on this page, a little further down, I think, is where some of the use cases, right? Some of the tasks are listed, which ones are. And which one does the model support and which ones will we allow. But that's kind of on the documentation side and transparency of knowing, yes, we've done this, we have this model in our sites, we've looked at it and we're happy with it. More model documentation. So in this case, looking at a prompt. So rather than the model itself, this is a prompt that uses a large language model. In this case, it's an insurance example.
Slide.
Yep, I think you've got it now.
In the previous slide,
yes.
I mean, this is just semantics more than anything.
Okay.
You have approved for deployment, but you also say it's non-compliant. I just wanted to get an idea.
Yes.
What did you mean by that? Is it because EU AI Act is not in place, but you are kind of preparing to have that visibility? I wasn't quite sure.
This is, this is probably compliant with regulatory or company policies, right? Yes, it's approved. There are some things that we don't like about it, so maybe those are things that are still being addressed. Good catch. Yeah, red is always, warning. Yeah. So in terms of following this prompt, so instead of governing the model, right, we're also governing the prompt. So that's the instruction to a model. In this case, it's an insurance application that interacts, right, an insurance claims handling application that interacts with a large language model. And we follow that prompt from when it was first created. An AI engineer, they try out various things to see which ones works best, and at some point there's a prompt that works. That's the one that gets adopted and gets deployed. It was tested, it was validated, and it's operating in production. And you can see there's a little exclamation mark there saying, we're monitoring this model, we're monitoring this prompt in production. Something is wrong with it, but we're tracking that from start to finish. For example, things like the training parameters, things like at the top there, when was the prompt created, who was the user, right? So kind of tracking the who did what when of this activity, in this case of this prompt, the training parameters, things like the data sets, other things we can capture from that model, from that prompt when it's being generated. Same thing applies to classical models or large language models in this case. And then the monitoring, the bottom of that triangle, again, this is that same insurance example where we're tracking it over time, maybe every hour, every day, whatever frequency makes sense. We look at the information that's being exchanged, the information going into the large language model and the response coming back. Right? We don't have to know exactly what goes on inside the black box, but we monitor this prompt, the information going back and forth. And we can do things like, at the top there, HAP, that's our abbreviation for hate, abuse, and profanity. So looking for toxic language, either in the information sent to a model or in the response coming back. And as long as that's under control, you can put a threshold on this. You can see the thresholds are between 0.1 and 0.2. As long as within that boundary, we've said we find this acceptable for this use case. Right, so use case driven. For some things you want to have it lower. For some things you might be less concerned about it. But that's something we can monitor. This is automated. As soon as something goes out of bounds here, it goes outside of the between the 0.1 and the 0.2. In the governance tooling, the model owner will get notified. Something is wrong with your model. You need to go investigate and potentially change a prompt or change model, or again, whatever the change request might be, right? Whatever the outcome might be. And we monitor things like Rouge scores and a few others that we will have in the production version. But those are, again, those typical large language model metrics that are different than an F1 score, for example, right? Not all tasks can be measured with an accuracy or an F1 or things like that. So those are kind of, just to help visualize a little bit what those things might look like in the tooling. I'm happy to talk more about this on the booth and show you more about this if that's of interest. But kind of, to give you a visual of what these things how they might come to life in your situation. And with that, I want to hand it back to HP to talk about how we apply some of these things and our own AI principles to the foundation models we train ourselves.
Is that what I'm going to talk about? Okay. I like this slide because it allows me to speak very warmly of IBM. We're not new to AI. We've been working with AI since 2011, when our Watson beat 2 reigning champions in Jeopardy, the TV show. Since 2011, we've done about 40,000 AI projects worldwide. And in 2013, our brilliant IBM research started to research explainability in machine learning. I have to speak very warmly of IBM Research. It's the biggest privately funded research organization in tech. We've had 25 years of solid patent leadership. Our CEO have now said that's no longer so important. We want to bring these guys into product development. And they are, trust me, they are thinking 2-3 years ahead of everybody else and really working on generative AI now. That was my pitch. In 2015, we appointed an Italian lady, Francesca Rossi, the worldwide global AI ethics leader. And in 2018, we established the IBM Ethical Board. They have obviously defined a framework for IBM's own application of AI. We use AI a lot, particularly in HR. But also they tell us which countries and which companies they want us to sell AI technology to. Some they don't want us to sell to. They also recommended in 2018 that we pull out of facial recognition software, not because of the software itself, but the difficult ethical question around racial classification. So IBM is no longer developing facial recognition software. In 2020, as the only big tech company in the world, we started to advocate AI regulation. We call it precision regulation. So very much in line with what the EU are doing, probably more in line with what the UK are doing. The UK have published their own white paper and say they favor innovation. Probably they do. But the UK being one nation, they can push the AI regulation down to the industry regulators, because AI is different in finance than it is in agriculture, than it is in other industries. So they're going to infuse AI knowledge into the industry regulators, whereas the EU is going to establish an AI sort of watchdog, But it's not easy to regulate for 27 countries. You can't do that on industry level. Where was I? Talking about this, yes. So I'm now firmly established IBM as a very serious player in this space. We are a lot of experience. We've defined 3 core principles that you need to adhere to, or we recommend that you need to adhere to succeed with your AI implementations. And it starts with trust at the core of everything you do, because if the users don't trust your AI, they're not going to use it. And if they're not going to use it, they're not going to have any adoption of it. And if you're not going to have any adoption of it, you're not going to have any return of investment on it. And then all of your AI is going to be killed by the board, because they're looking for at least 10, 15, 20, 25% return of investment, not 5.4%, which is currently the case, right? So it starts with trust at the core. And the first central principle is that data and insight belongs to the creator. It doesn't belong to anybody else. To you. Only you. It doesn't belong to OpenAI or Meta or Google or anybody else. It belongs to you. If anybody collects your data and input, they break this fundamental principle. In IBM, we are not incredibly happy with the term artificial intelligence, because artificial implies you take human intelligence and replace it with something that isn't. That's not the point with this technology. The point with this technology is to augment our own intelligence. So we consistently refer to AI as augmented intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. We've spoken about the requirement for transparency and explainability, but it starts with your data. We've released 2 quite generic foundation models, and we've trained them on the IBM Blue data pile. I love that term, data pile. We've scraped petabytes of data from various domains, internet, legal, patents, whatever. We've curated that data down to terabytes. We've removed stuff from sources that we can't validate. We've removed hate, profanity, abusive language. And we've also removed data elements that we think might violate data privacy and intellectual property rights. And we can actually provide you with a full transparent data set from this data pile. Metadata from the data, which data went into the pile, which didn't, and why, and full lineage. If you ask me, that's a minimum requirement that you should request from your supplier of foundation models. If they can't provide you with information about the data the foundation model is trained on, how can you trust it? How can you trust that you don't break data privacy issues from the content generated by the model? Some might say that you can opt out. That's fine, you can opt out. But there are multiple users of the same model, and if your supplier collects and retrains the model on the data supplied by the other users, you still risk running into data privacy issues and ownership issues, right? So this is just to tell you how IBM is doing it. We interface with the biggest open source marketplace for AI and foundation models called Hugging Face. And whatever models that we expose inside our own experience from Hugging Face are approved by IBM Legal. If they're not, then we don't take any responsibility for it. Simple. There you go. These are some of the principles, transparency principles, that you should ask yourself when you start adopting foundation models. And this is really, really moving rapidly. I think at Hugging Face are experiencing some 5,000 new foundation models monthly now. I mean, they're a relatively small startup, but they're already worth trillions if they ever list. Data sources, we've spoken about data sources. If you just scrape the internet to, I don't know, let's just pick randomly September 2021, and you can't provide any insight on what data it's trained on, how can you trust it? Data governance and processing, key data process, I said that. Data and AI governance belongs in boardrooms. One thing is the risk you run from a regulatory perspective, right? But I can tell you, most companies on the planet have an ethical framework that goes over and beyond just not breaking the law, right? There's a reputation at stake too. So even if a supplier of a foundation model says, well, I'll pay you fine, that's fine. It's not the supplier's reputation on the line, it's yours, right? And how you treat your clients ultimately. Algorithmic details, I think the question we had earlier today, would you trust a supplier that doesn't reveal the algorithms going into the models? Certainly the EU are talking about maintaining a repository of source code. That's going to be interesting. Compute details, energy consumption, we've spoken all about that as well. Lastly, before we open up for questions, IBM, that was announced last week, I think. Yeah. Indemnification when using IBM's foundation models basically means if you're taken to court for data privacy issues or intellectual property breach of that, we'll pay your legal fines. Sorry, we'll pay your legal expenses and the fines if you're judged to have broken any. Okay. That's the end of our slides. I think we're ready for. Do you want to come back up on stage? And if there are any questions, we'll attempt to answer them to the best of our ability.
And these things, by way of summary, I guess some of the things we talked about.
Yeah, we'll just leave that as a background.
How to, right? These are some of the things we talked about. So if you want to think about how do you see in your own organization, here are, 7 tips to think about.
Hi.
Yes, sir. Hi.
Some up here. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
oh.
I had a question. So you showed your dashboard, and I think that's a cool thing to have this kind of insight and an overview. And then you said and then we look into bias and fairness. So looking at fairness, this is an incredibly difficult concept to even define. So how did you do that, or what's your experience in working with clients and defining what bias or fairness should actually mean, and how to define the boundaries of what's acceptable?
Right. Yeah, from a technical perspective, there are currently kind of accepted metrics to do that. as part of the developing standards that HP talked about, right? We will get a list of these are the things, kind of the state of the art of how you do that. From a kind of a definition perspective, to us, I think it's kind of making sure that different groups of customers, typically, right, different groups of people is what it typically deals with, get the same treatment. So if you are going to a bank to request a loan, it shouldn't matter if you're a male or a female customer applying. The number of people that get the loan or don't get the loan in those two groups should be roughly the same. That same logic applies to many different situations. Where is it based on gender or age or whatever? And what is the outcome, right? What is a positive outcome? What is a negative outcome? And making sure that those things are within a certain balance of each other. So that's how we approach it from the software perspective.
That said, some industries discriminate, though, and have that as a business model, right? Insurance companies. If you're a young male, you're going to pay a much higher premium because your peers are, driving like crazy, right? And that's just how it works. Now, I think discrimination is going to be an issue that we need to probably discuss in a broader context. The EU AI Act deals with discrimination as a concept. And I live in Denmark, and in Greater Copenhagen, the Alarm Central have trained an AI model to listen into every call that comes into the Alarm Central. And that model detects signs in language and how you speak for sort of sudden heart failure. So it basically deploys the ambulance before you know that you're going to have a heart problem, right? It detects about 100 cases every year. So arguably it saves 100 lives every year. But it's trained on native Danish language speakers. So according to the EU AI Act, where you can't discriminate in your application of AI, that model may be prohibited. And from a societal perspective, we might have to revisit things like discrimination and when is it, to the benefit of the society and when is it proper discrimination. Just an interesting side note. Thanks for your question.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't think it's working.
It is.
First of all, thanks a lot for all of your presentations. Amazing work and really not only well thought through, but also super practical. Appreciate it. I have two questions. One, I'm from UNICEF. We operate in 190 countries in the world, and the harmonization of international standards for AI and data is a headache.
No shit.
So the EU Act, fantastic, really, really exciting to see some regulations finally in this space after GDPR and everything. In the US, there is NIST AI risk management framework, and they are working right now on the generative AI risk management framework, and there are other attempts. You mentioned the UK. What would be your recommendations or your expectations, at least, for the standardization across the globe? Because the problem is, the value chain for AI is global.
Yeah.
The data will be collected in the EU, labeled in Kenya, processed in the US, and then sold to the customers in the EU back. That's a little bit of a problem.
It's a great question because we can't even agree on what the definition of an AI system is, right? The EU has one, the UK has another, and in the US probably 52 different, right? Because it might not be one federal law in the US, it might be down to each state or even city. We know that New York City has specific legislation around hiring, right, for AI, using AI. But we speak to the Senate. As a big tech, we speak to the Senate, and we advocate precision regulation, like we spoke about, much in the same way that the UK does it, to avoid regulating the tech itself. But it doesn't really matter where the data is stored or processed, it's where the AI is applied. Right? So from a regulatory perspective, so the EU doesn't care if your data sits in the US, if you use it against your clients in the EU. To gain market access to the EU, you need to be compliant from a regulatory perspective to use it, right? That's our expectation. Now, we've encouraged the EU to look at 4 areas to align their definition of an AI system with the OECD. And currently the EU Council has a definition on the table that looks very similar to the OECD. The Parliament wants it differently, so let's see who wins that battle, right? And it's also, some rebalance the responsibility between developers of models and deployers of models. Developers must have a certain responsibility as well, particularly around data governance and data transparency. And, it's sort of things like that we recommend it. But we are absolutely we share World Trade Organization's concerns that global organizations like UNICEF has to deploy different versions of the same AI model in different markets to be compliant, right? So the World Trade Organization is advocating ISO to have international standards, so at least you have a set of standards that applies to several legislations. The EU doesn't want that, because they did that for GDPR, and they're still meeting in court over GDPR, right? So they want Senelec, and the UK says, well, nobody writes better standards than us. So they're going to write their own standards. So this is going to be Wild West for a while. It's quite noisy now, sorry.
Are you ready for another one?
Sure, hit us.
Okay. So very impressed with the role IBM is playing in setting the right stage, setting the right example on ethics and privacy concerning AI. I've been mighty impressed. Here's my question. So we have all these big techs floating their large foundation models. Where is IBM on this one? I know you have data, but you do not have a foundation model.
We have two now.
Okay.
We have two out in the wild now, and we're going to release several more. Trained on the data piles concept and we're going to make more industry-specific foundation models. We've released one with NASA, actually, which is sort of a geospatial one that monitors the health of the Earth, I guess.
So you're going to be more vertically aligned on the foundation models?
Yes, you can.
Because IBM is not looking in just having our own foundation models. We're also looking in how can you make, and how do you put other foundations enterprise ready, right? So we have also a studio where we work with Hugging Face. So we're really saying, either you do bring your own model. We also will be building our own models. We're also with research working on foundation models that are very specific to healthcare, right? It's not just all LLMs, but we're for sure not, saying we want to win the rat race of foundation models. We are contributing, because this is how I think we should look at it, is everyone is contributing models to the space, and we help through tooling like AI governance. Of course, when, we will be able to do this governance around ChatGPT, it will still not be 100%, but there are really new techniques how you can be governing those models. So I think it's, again, we're not in the competition there. It's contributing and making sure how can we put all those existing models into a business and business perspective, and how can we govern those to the max, right? So I think, that's a bit IBM's perspective.
Yep, we are over time, but we've time for one more question. Yes.
Hi. Yes. Thank you. So I had two, but I will choose one. I hooked on one line that you said earlier, which is AI governance needs to be in the boardroom.
Yes.
Any tips or advice on how to convince your boardroom that they need to be tackling responsible AI?
The customer case that Annelise mentioned, we were struggling for a while because we talked governance to the data science population, and they just wanted data science stuff, right? And then we brought the CEO and the chief compliance officer to New York to talk about another American customer and how they had implemented AI governance. And the CEO immediately saw that this is just a requirement, and we move this into the boardroom because, but it needs to be anchored at that level. It does. And start talking about regulation, because chances are you as a business, as a company, you're going to have one or more high-risk use cases, and then the regulators here are going to have really specific requirements for you, right? And that is a boardroom matter, because no board would want to see your company on the front page of a newspaper that is saying you screwed up.
And I think there too, it's not just AI models, as we said, right? Sometimes you're making a decision based on an average, but you can be very biased by working on averages too, right?
Yeah.
So indeed, the data team, they felt that they were doing with open source, they had their techniques to be monitoring their AI, so they felt that they were perfectly fine, right? So, and until we brought it into the boardroom, who has really this helicopter view and saying, yeah, but I'm not talking about your 50 models, I'm talking about 700 models throughout my company, right? And that is really only at the boardroom where they're really understanding that, and the risk managers get that.
And the reality is that we've been deploying AI in silos for years, right? So very few big companies actually know the state of their AI deployment or how many models they have in production, because various silos have done it. That would be a major concern for me if I was a company operating in the EU and now regulation is coming in, right? That's a boardroom level issue.
Thank you so much. And my other one was around the intersect between AI regulations. So as the UNICEF question came, obviously there's lots of regulations globally and definitions of AI and that sort of thing. But there's also this in sector-specific areas, clashing regulations that might actually be really difficult to navigate. Say I'm in pharmaceuticals, so healthcare regulations, health data sharing, that sort of thing, and then the AI regulation. How to navigate all. Anything you can comment on that?
No, I think that's a very valid concern. You're absolutely right. And we need to infuse AI competencies into the industry regulators, but also in the compliance and risk levels of any company, right? But absolutely right. I think we have a lot of health data that could be useful in AI context for treatment of various diseases, for actually finding new treatment as well. But at the moment, we have GDPR rules that are actually hindering us using them, because even though they can be anonymized, you can still, in many cases, figure out who the patient was, right? And you're not supposed to. So I think we're only scratching the surface on regulation and changing regulation as well.
If I can add to that, Europe is working on a case where they might have all the data, because they're seeing that we have so much data that we're not using for healthcare, while if we would have way more insights, it's not that good. So if we would have more insights, for example, if we would have everyone's data on health and we would be doing research, we might find out that certain medication is working well for male but not for female, right? And I know Europe has a big project there in how can we access the data while still having that privacy, right? So it's both ways, that because me neither, I don't want to share all my data and I don't want them to know everything about me, but sometimes it hinders innovation. So you can Google it. You will find about that project. So, yeah.
Thank you.
We're here today and tomorrow, so come see us, booth C30. Happy to continue, any discussion, any question, any point of view that you'd like. Thank you so much for your questions.